Thanks for joining me today. We're here to talk about B43 and particularly our new grapefruit variant of B43. So we find that B43 for us is, from a business perspective, one of the best, most solid movers that we have in our portfolio. And the concept behind B43 initially, some of you might remember, was to make a brut IPA. And for us, the approach was essentially, it's easy to forget that at the time that brut IPAs were coming out, New England IPAs were still nascent. So they were still growing in terms of recognition and people liking them. And we felt as brewers at Old Nation that brut IPAs were really sort of a West Coast response to the East Coast phenomenon of New England IPAs, right? And that West Coast brewers were essentially saying, okay, well, what is it that people like about these New England IPAs, and how can we keep that a little bit closer to what it is that we've been doing? So you might remember the West Coast IPAs, specifically West Coast IPAs, not kind of the variants that started being brewed in the Rocky Mountains in the Midwest slightly after, but your Pliny, for example, was pretty dry, not a lot of malt, really, really focused on showcasing both hop bitterness and hop aroma and flavor back at the turn of the century. So around late 90s, early 2000s. So it is that we thought focus on dry malt character, not much malt character, that the West Coast brewers who were making brut IPAs were really focusing on when they're making brut IPAs, more than the kind of champagne-y dryness. I think that was really the brut IPA failure, we think really was a failure of choosing a name more than a failure of how that brand operates. So here's what we liked about it. Low to no carbohydrates, right? So the carbohydrates that a properly made brut will represent are coming exclusively from alcohol. And so there's no residual sugar. That dryness without the bitterness that would be supporting a traditional West Coast IPA. And again, we're using enzymes to make sure that sugar is reduced to nothing, which they were not doing in the West Coast IPAs. But having that sugar reduced to nothing, it's interesting because a lot of the hops that we're using are sweet, right? They evoke the sense of sweetness because they're, maybe dragon fruit or mango or orange, right? So there is sort of a psychological aspect to this where, drinking a beer without any residual sugars accompanied by these really fruity hops that are really identifiable to the drinker makes a really interesting beer, right? It is low carbohydrates, low to no carbohydrates, again, excepting alcohol. And then also this real focus on hop aroma and flavor, and the ability for the consumer's mind and perspective to sort of shape their experience with that beer, we thought was really interesting. And so we saw brut IPAs kind of fall by the wayside, but not B43, strangely. And so this has become a sort of stand-in for lagered IPAs, cold IPAs that I think a lot of people are making. I think it hits a lot of the same notes. And in any event, here in Michigan, particularly and around the Great Lakes, B43, again, has always been a really solid producer for us. So for us, we want to take something that in the Great Lakes and in Michigan is a really great beer for us, right? That people consistently buy. We obviously have a fan base there. We like the beer. We think it's really interesting. And it's one of the favorites of a lot of the folks that work here, particularly folks that are involved in CrossFit, et cetera. So, what we're trying to do with the Grapefruit IPA is essentially just give it a little more oomph to what it's already carrying, right? Grapefruit is already present in that beer. The hops that we're using in B43 are the same that we're using in M43. So there obviously is a big citrus aspect, and part of that citric aspect is the pithy astringency of grapefruit. And so what we're doing is adding a really excellent grapefruit puree and extract to B43 in order to accentuate that flavor and make that aroma even more intense and more identifiable as grapefruit. And our result here has been something that we are extremely excited about. We think that it is absolutely what this beer needs to kind of put it up to the next level. Price doesn't change, but the effect absolutely does. We'll see how the market accepts it, how drinkers accept it. We hope that they'll love it, and it'll broaden the reach of this beer. We think that doing it as a short release is the best way to enter into the market with it, but we definitely do have room in our production schedule next year that we've specifically set aside for Grapefruit B43, should this be a successful release. So looking forward to feedback, looking forward to everyone else's thoughts. Again, we don't release beers that we're not proud of here at Old Nation, but this is one that we are very excited about, along with being proud of it. So hopefully you are too, and we'll look to talk to you a little bit more after the middle of October when this beer comes out. Thanks for sticking with me.